Good afternoon. This is Block 4, Lecture 1, The Founders on Human Nature and Government. James Madison said it best when he said that if men were angels, there would be no need for government. So the Founders started off kind of on this recognition that people are not perfect, and people are not only not perfect, but people are not perfectible. And if you try to set up your government assuming that you will have perfect people or that people will become perfect over time, then you're setting yourself up for a catastrophe. The other thing that kind of the Founders recognize, that not only are people not angels, but it's that people like power. People, all sorts of people like power. They like to exercise control and have influence over other people. So it was kind of with those two things fundamentally in mind, that people like power and that people are not angels, that the Founders kind of set about their task. One of the words that was constantly used during the Revolutionary period was the word liberty. The liberties of Englishmen, the liberties of the American people, the liberties of the states. How can we define liberty in a way where it makes sense to understand kind of what the Founders were doing, not only during the Revolution, but in the Constitution-making process that's going on, in the late 1780s. And the best way, I think, to think about liberty is to define liberty as a space where power can't touch you. That liberty is a space where your power is your own to exercise as you see fit. That the liberty in religion means that nobody but your own self and your can dictate to you what religion you follow. That liberty in the sense of where can you find a job means the liberty to do the best you can without somebody telling you where and how to find employment. Liberty is a space. Liberty is a space where no power can touch you. So then the Founders kind of jumped from there. They said, okay, what's the purpose of government? How do we set up this government? We have this Declaration of Independence, this beautiful statement that, we have these inalienable rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, property, and that government exists to protect those rights. How can government protect those rights? How do we set up a state? How do we set up the functions of a government where two things are going on? One, we maximize individual liberty, and two, how do we make that government strong enough to do the things that a government has to do, to repress rebellions and to, keep foreign armies far, far away? How do you make a government strong enough to send foreign armies away and to repress domestic rebellion? How do you make a government strong enough to do that, but weak enough where individual people have that space of liberty in their life? That kind of implies a bit of a contradiction, that a government strong enough to, throw out a foreign army would also be strong enough to throw out your rights. So what has to happen is, what the Founders were trying to do with the nature of government here was realize that a government must restrict itself. That government must have a set of rules of things that it cannot do. A way to protect that space of liberty for individual citizens while making sure that those individual citizens are not at the mercy of some foreign army or the latest rebel to come down the pike. Because what would happen if you had a really powerful government without restrictions, then you are depending on the people in the government to restrict themselves. That if we say, okay, we're going to have a dictator or a king, but the dictator or the king is going to be really nice and he's going to give all the people the liberties that they deserve, then that in theory could work. You could have a really nice king that really wants to take care of all of his people. But it also stands to reason that that king could be a schmuck, that the king could go back on his word, and in either case we are depending on the personality of the king not to infringe upon the rights of the people. And for the Founders, that was not going to work, because by human nature, people like power. If you give people power, people will use power. So the only way to prevent people from using power is to restrict the power that you give them. But government needs power. It needs to repel foreign invasions and do all the things like that. How? So the first question that the founders kind of set themselves to was, how do you restrict a government's power over itself? And we need to think about that, because the way that's done, in a lot of ways, is in the Constitution. Another thing that the founders kind of believed and felt very strongly about government was that they did not like monarchy. That, a term of opprobrium was monarchist. You're a monarchist. No one should listen to you. You're a monarchist. They did not like aristocracy, by and large. They did not like a class of people that by birth kind of felt themselves and were recognized legally as better than other people. But they were just as skeptical of the people. They were just as skeptical of democracy. They said, look, the people can be easily fooled by demagogues, by smart people, by people with silver tongues, can fool the common people. And it would be pretty common. And they said a mob of fooled people is just as dangerous to liberty, if not more dangerous to liberty, than a king is. That they said, we do not want to replace one tyrant 3,000 miles away with 3,000 tyrants 1 mile away. That the power of the people could not be put in charge totally of the government either. They are skeptical of what they call mob rule, the power of the unchecked people, uneducated people, not virtuous people, people who have been tricked, people who have been fooled. So now you have to do two things in this government. You have to make a government that is self-restrictive, and you have to set up a government that has some kind of guarantees against the people making wrong decisions, against the people being whipped up into a frenzy, into a mob, and choosing politicians and people and ideas and things that the government does based on the emotion of the moment, or based on what some really good speaker tells them that they should want to do, or what they should want, or what they should go to do. That a mob was that democracy. Small d democracy, like the Athenians practiced it, that small d democracy was just as dangerous to liberty as monarchy was to the founders. So they were going to try to thread a fine line here. Their solution was republicanism, a situation where the people elect representatives to represent them. But there was a problem with that also. They looked in history and they saw that every republic that they saw about, read about, knew about, and that was pretty much all of them in history, they knew that there was not a single example of a successful republic in almost 2,000 years of history. That the Roman Republic had been overthrown by Julius Caesar, the Venetian Republic had been, kind of captured by its aristocracy, that republics in history did not work. And now here they were trying to create a republic when most of the world looked at this idea, looked at this experiment and said it's not possible. Republics don't work. You need a monarchy, you need an aristocracy, or the result will be rule by the mob. So the founders were faced with a very difficult task due to their views on human nature, due to their views on government. It required people, the founders assumed that people were self-interested, that people were out for themselves and their families, and they did not think that it was a bad thing. Like, people have to look out for themselves and their families, but they also wanted to instill, they thought it was necessary to instill what they called Republican virtue. That you can't have a republic without Republican virtue. That to some degree, your desires have to subsume themselves to the desires of the wider community. Now that's a dangerous idea. We don't want to start telling people that you always have to do what's best for society, because who gets to define what's best for society? Who gets to do that? How do we define it? By what criteria? But Republican virtue was kind of this idea that while you considered you and yours important, you also had to have an eye on, those things that are greater than you, the nation, your state, and you should do things that were not always self-interested, that disinterestedness was an important virtue, and you saw that when you read about George Washington. That you should approach certain things, not what's better for you or worse for you, but what's better for the entire nation or the entire state or the entire community. And that's a big part of Republican virtue. The idea that all people are generally equal, the idea that all people are to be treated with some degree of respect is a Republican virtue. But mostly it's the idea that if we're going to rule ourselves, we have to be able to recognize that our own interests sometimes have to subsume themselves to the interests of the wider community. And then the founders, ask the question, okay, we have this definition of Republican virtue, it's really important. How do you create it in people? How do you get people to be virtuous? If you need virtuous people to run a free government, and the founders believe you did need virtuous people to run a free government, how do you create virtue? Is another fascinating question that the founders and early Americans would have to try to answer. And we still have to try to answer. How do you guarantee that we can keep this free republic that the founders bestowed on us? Because human nature from back then, when James Madison said men are not angels, that has not changed one iota. Men are still after power, as are women. Men and women and people are after power, and you do not want to live in a government where the power is controlled by one person, one group of people, one class of people, or anything like that. And to prevent that from happening, we have to go back and figure out how government can restrict itself. And the only way government can restrict itself is by having a people virtuous enough to run their own affairs. And that's the trick to the American experience.